Hello, everyone, and welcome to Box Seat Banter. I'm your host, Billy Ballas, a baseball coach and someone who's been a part of baseball my whole life. I'm broadcasting today from Bernie Brewer's slide in Miller Park. And joining me today is Kyle Loebner. You can find him on Twitter at @ByKyleLoebner. He's the former managing editor of Brew Crew Ball. He currently writes for the Shepherd Express, and he covers minor league baseball for the Wisconsin Timber Rattlers, and he produces Today in Brewers History. Kyle, great to have you on the program today.
Hey, great to be here, although we may have to hurry if we're going to be up on Bernie Brewer's slide the whole time because the Brewers are pretty protective of this space.
Well, now we're talking about the Brewers, and they began play back in 1969 as the Seattle Pilots, and they were only in Seattle for 1 year. Then they moved to Milwaukee to become the Brewers. It's kind of unfortunate for those Seattle fans that they only get 1 year, then they leave town, and it's kind of a lot of times. When teams move, they take the name with them, but they left the Pilots in Seattle and they established a, Milwaukee name that's much more fitting of Milwaukee. The Brewers, have the rich brewing history in Milwaukee.
Right.
And another interesting thing about them, they, as I just mentioned, they were in the American League. And they were in the American League until they moved to the National League in 1998. I think there's just been two teams, I think, who have changed leagues. They changed leagues then, and then the Astros a few years later. They played in Milwaukee County Stadium from 1970 to 2000. Kyle, do you remember where some of the listeners may have seen Milwaukee County Stadium?
Yeah, they may have seen County Stadium in Brewers games, obviously, and in highlights, but also it was the home stadium for the Cleveland MLB franchise in Major League.
That's right, yeah.
And that's actually, kind of a lesser part of Milwaukee's film history because, of course, Miller Park appeared in the later classic movie Mr. 3000 as the home ballpark. My wife actually was in the crowd as an extra.
Nice. Very nice. Yeah. And the fictional Cleveland Indians from that movie Major League, they borrowed Milwaukee's stadium, and they also borrowed Milwaukee's announcer, Bob Uecker, who played Harry Doyle in that movie. I believe that Milwaukee has, arguably a great, because Uecker does the radio from the Brewers,
right?
And is it Brian Anderson?
Yeah, the Brewers have been really fortunate for the last, really for quite a while now. They've had some really fantastic announce teams, and it's not just Bob Uecker on the radio side. There are broadcasters now all over the game who worked with Bob Uecker and then moved on to become the lead announcer for other teams. Corey Provis is with the Twins. Joe Block is with the Pirates. Jim Powell with the Braves. Len Casper with the Cubs are all folks who worked with Bob Uecker and then went on to become kind of their own thing other places. And on the TV side, yeah, Brian Anderson has done a fantastic job kind of working around his national obligations to provide kind of a consistent voice for the Brewers franchise all this time. And when he is gone, there's another really great Wisconsin broadcaster named Matt LePay, who is the voice of Wisconsin Badgers football, is his primary occupation, but has done a really great job filling in as well. And so, I think Brewer fans really get kind of spoiled by the quality of our broadcasts. The more I watch other games on MLB TV, the more I listen to other radio broadcasts, the more I recognize just how good we have it here locally.
Yeah, so I feel like, as you said, with that MLB TV, fans across the country can more easily access those home broadcasters from other teams. And yeah, I've been exposed to Bob Uecker through the Major League franchise, and as well as some other games, and he's great. And then, yeah, Brian Anderson, as you mentioned, I feel like he's one of the best announcers in baseball. And yeah, I enjoy when he's calling a national game that I'm watching as well. So as we mentioned, they played in Milwaukee County Stadium from 1970 to 2000. Then they moved into Miller Park next door. They've been in there since 01. They have 2 division titles in this time frame that we're going over in the past 25 years. They've won the NL Central in both 2011 and 2018. They were the wild card winners in 08 and 2019. They do not have a National League pennant in this time frame or a World Series championship. Obviously, if they don't have the pennant, they can't win the World Series. They made 1 World Series appearance. That was back in 1982 when they won the American League pennant, and they lost to the Cardinals in the World Series. Now, Kyle, they have been, successful recently. Are they going to end that World Series drought anytime soon?
It really seems like, at least on paper right now, the best opportunity to do so might have been the last couple of seasons, 2018 and 2019. The 2018 team especially really seemed to have things going and was 1 game away from going to the World Series. They went to Game 7 against the Dodgers, really had a day where if just a couple things had gone a different way, they would have broken that drought. Right now, there's been a lot of turnover on this roster for 2020. Christian Yelich is going to be a Brewer for a long time. Keston Hiura is going to be a Brewer for a long time. But beyond that, there's a lot of question marks in this franchise right now. And I actually just wrote for Shepherd Express this week about the fact that with all the turnover they've had, with Mike Moustakas leaving, with Yasmani Grandal leaving, with Eric Thames leaving, the replacements that they kind of tabbed to fill those spots haven't done so well so far this year. And right now, it really looks like they may have made a bit of a setback to their long-term prognosis.
Okay, so we will be watching them in the future, but shortly we'll be looking back to the past as we take a look back at the past 25 years with some of their players and managers, owners, and general managers. So stay tuned for that. On the show last week about the Cubs, our trivia question was back in 2016 when the Cubs won the World Series. Who were the 3 winning pitchers in their 3 series clinching wins? So I believe it was NLDS Game 4, NLCS Game 6, and World Series Game 7. Now, Kyle, before I reveal the answer, do you have a guess on any of those 3 names?
I do know a couple of them. I think everyone kind of remembers the Game 7 of the World Series, the way that one wrapped up. The last pitcher on the mound for the Cubs has been kind of a firebrand over the years for a variety of reasons. Aroldis Chapman.
Yes, he did pick up the win in that World Series Game 7. He actually did not get the last out. But that game went extra innings. He was on the mound. He gave up that home run to Rajai Davis, which tied the game. And then he was the pitcher of record when the Cubs retook the lead. And then I think he gave up like a run and then a hit in the bottom of the whatever inning that was. And then Mike Montgomery got to save. But yes, you're correct. Aroldis Chapman did get the win. So that's one of the 3.
And then the other one that I remember, because I think it's become such a storyline for the other guy's career, is that the final game of that Cubs-Dodgers series was Kyle Hendricks against Clayton Kershaw.
Yes.
Hendricks with kind of his upper 80s fastball and stuff that just doesn't seem like it should play in the modern game. Outdueled Clayton Kershaw in that game. So I remember Kyle Hendricks as well.
That's correct. And
the third one I do not recall.
So in the NLDS Game 4, I think they scored like 4 runs in the 9th against the Giants or something like that to take the lead and win. And that was Hector Rondon. So Hector Rondon, winning pitcher in NLDS Game 4. And yeah, you're correct with Kyle Hendricks and Aroldis Chapman as they were the winning pitchers in Game 6 of the NLCS and Game 7 of the World Series, respectively. So that brings us to this week's trivia question about the Brewers. And it is, who is the career stolen base leader for the Brewers? So our listeners out there, if you want to fancy a guess, you can throw out a guess on Twitter, on Instagram. It's at Boxseat Banter. And Kyle, I will offer that to you to throw out a guess if you have one.
Well, I do know the answer to this one. And so instead of spoiling it for everyone out there, I will offer a clue. As you look through Brewers franchise history, there is one person who is atop almost every leaderboard, career hits, runs, RBI, and it's not that guy. That is the correct answer to this question. So I won't spoil it for everybody, but yes, I do know the answer to this one. I believe he's somewhere in the 400s. I might even be 420s all time is the number you're looking for.
I think that's very good. Yeah, I believe he had career over 500 stolen bases, and I think you're pretty spot on with his amount with the Brewers. And yeah, I kind of pulled this one because it did come as a bit of a surprise to me when I saw that he was the stolen base leader. Now, looking back at the Brewers, they were owned by Bud Selig from 1970 to 1992. Now, Bud Selig is very well known for being the commissioner of baseball for several years. He is a Milwaukee native. He was working for several years to try to get a team to Milwaukee. He even had, are you familiar, Kyle, with his efforts to buy the Chicago White Sox?
I am. The White Sox were having attendance woes in the gap between when the Milwaukee Braves left Milwaukee and when the Seattle Pilots came to town and became the Brewers. And they actually played several home games in Milwaukee, or the White Sox played several home games in Milwaukee, one against each AL team in both 1968 and 1969. So the Seattle Pilots' first game in Milwaukee was actually as a visiting team. They came to Milwaukee in 1969 to play the White Sox.
Yeah, so Selig had a deal to buy the White Sox and bring them to Milwaukee, but it kind of fell apart because the Major League Baseball at the time did not want Chicago to lose their American League teams. They were the second biggest city in the country at that time. So that deal fell apart. Eventually, he was able to buy the Pilots and move them to Milwaukee, which then, of course, left Seattle without a team for a while. Because and what are people in Milwaukee's view of Bud Selig? Because I know around the country, he's not thought of very highly. I don't think many commissioners are thought of very highly. People usually dislike them, and although now Selig looks a lot better than what we currently have in Rob Manfred. But what do people in Milwaukee think of Selig?
I think it's a mixed legacy. For fans who are older, who remember some of the early years of the Brewers, Selig will always be the guy who brought baseball back to Milwaukee. There is a statue of Bud Selig outside Miller Park. I think it's completely fair to say that without Bud Selig, there is not a Brewers team in Milwaukee. There's probably not Miller Park. The city's sports history kind of changes without him. Now, with that said, in the later years of the Selig era, the team languished, at least in part because of ownership. Through the early 90s, kind of the teardown of the 1992 team when Paul Molitor left, and when things really started to come apart and the Brewers kind of fell into a tailspin that lasted for a couple of decades. And then the Selig family owned the team all the way through to 2002 after Bud Selig had to divest himself of it to become commissioner. There were a lot of kind of missteps in there, and there were a lot of times where the team was penny wise but dollar foolish. Just kind of let things slide a little bit, really, really played up the small market card, really ran some small salaries. And they really positioned the franchise to a point where when Mark Anastasio came in, it was not terribly difficult for him to be treated as a hero. Because he came in, he invested in the franchise, even to kind of a mid-level amount. The Brewers never, led the big leagues in salary or anything like that, but they were in a position to become much more serious very quickly. And I think that allowed Anastasio, who is a guy who's not from Milwaukee, to very quickly endear himself to his new fan base.
Okay, yeah. So it is interesting seeing the Milwaukee perspective on Bud Selig, since they have a much different perspective than the rest of the country. So yeah, Selig on the team through '92. He became acting commissioner and had to give up his control in the team, and then he eventually was made the full time commissioner, and he held that position until Rob Manfred took over recently. So when Selig became commissioner, his daughter, Wendy Selig Prieb, ran the team up until, as you mentioned, Mark Atanasio bought the team, and he's been the owner since 2004. And, from my perspective, he's done a great job as owner.
Yeah.
And
Like I said before, he was, well positioned to be a very good owner. He didn't have to do a lot to kind of give the appearance that he put more of an effort in than I think the Seligs did in the later years. But he has demonstrated a strong interest in winning. He has demonstrated a willingness to invest in the team when he feels like it is required or beneficial to do so. And so, yeah, I think if you were to take a poll across baseball, and I think Fangraphs has done this about how teams feel about their ownership or how fans feel about their team's ownership, Mark Ananazio routinely rates pretty high.
Okay, and so now looking back at some of their general managers, Sal Bando was the GM from 91 to 99. Then Dean Taylor had a run from 99 to 02. Then Doug Melvin ran the team from 03 to 2015. He was the GM for the division winning team in 2011, as well as a wild card in 08. And then David Stearns is their current general manager. He's been at the helm since 2015. So, Kyle, how do the Brewers fans feel about their general managers? Because to me, it seems like the team is well run. Doug Melvin, I feel like, did a pretty good job, and David Stearns seems like they got Yelich in that trade. They've found some guys who've been very productive for them. So how do the Brewers fans feel about their GMs?
You can really draw a line in franchise history between the first two names that you mentioned and the that you mentioned. The Sal Bando and Dean Taylor eras are not looked back upon fondly. Bando was very early in his run as GM when Paul Molitor left after the 92 season, and really the last competitive Brewer team for about 15 years was dismantled for parts. Bando had the famous quote that Molitor was just a DH before he went to Toronto and was very nearly the MVP the next season, and it offered him an absurdly low amount of money. And then when Doug Melvin came in the mid 2000s, that's really when you start to talk about the Brewers building the first winning team. That's when you start to talk about the Prince Fielders and the Ricky Weekses and the Ryan Brauns and the people who really built a core for this franchise for the years to come. And so I think, Melvin was not without his flaws. And I think certainly there are things that he did that fans remember negatively, but for the most part, he is seen as kind of the guiding force that I think brought winning baseball back to Milwaukee after a long time without it. And David Stearns, I think, has a lot of respect from the fan base right now as being kind of the guy with the reputation of being the smartest guy in the room. That the guy who sees things before they happen, the guy who can predict the future a little bit. And so I think, the last two Brewers GMs, history is going to treat pretty kindly. And that's a stark contrast from the two that came before them.
Okay, so you have a great knowledge of the owners and GMs. Let's see how you do with the managers. So I've got a little fact, a little tidbit about some of their past managers going back in the past quarter century. And let's see if you can identify the manager from that fact. So they had a manager who was, in his playing days, he was nicknamed Scrap Iron.
Okay.
And if that doesn't give it away for you, this one might will. Back in 1995, as the Brewer manager in a game against the White Sox, there was a brawl, and he exchanged blows with White Sox manager Terry Bevington. And he also, as a player, hit grand slams in back-to-back games in 1978.
Well, the manager you're talking about is the Brewers' all-time win leader. That's Phil Garner. And I think I was at that game where he got a new ball with the White Sox. I was certainly at the game in 1995 at County Stadium where the hottest game time temperature in Milwaukee baseball history was recorded. It was 104 at first pitch, and there was still a brawl that day because the Brewers and White Sox hated each other that much.
Yeah, and so he was manager from 92 to 99, so a pretty long run there for him. They had a manager who, as a player, had his career third highest stolen base percentage among players with at least 400 steals.
That is Davey Lopes.
Correct. Yeah. So he managed the team from 2002, his only managerial run. He's been a first base coach for several teams. I believe he's retired from coaching now. He was also, as a player, part of the infield for the Dodgers, the 4 members, first baseman, second baseman, third baseman, and shortstop, who played together for 8.5 years there in LA. Now they had a manager who was the first non-Korean to manage in the KBO.
That is Jerry Royster.
Impressive.
Came in after Davey Lopes in 2002 to finish that season. And one of the more disastrous seasons in Brewer franchise history. And fair or unfair, I think he wears the blame for a fair amount of that.
Now they have a manager who, in between his playing days and his coaching days, he had a brief career as a taxidermist.
Yeah, that could only be Ned Yost.
That's correct. He also
a lot of Ned Yost stories from over the years.
Is there any one of your favorites that you want to share?
I think Ned was conversationally, Ned tend to lean on the same phrases repeatedly. And so there are a lot of things that, when Jeff Suppan was a Brewer, for example, when asked about him after just about every start, Ned Yost would tell reporters, "Soup pitched great today." So, it became a running joke. If Jeff Suppan gave up back-to-back home runs in the 4th inning, you'd start to see Soup pitched great circling around. And so, yeah, I think a very memorable character in Brewers history. And I think a guy who learned a lot from his time with the Brewers that he took forward with his time with the Royals, where he eventually won a World Series there.
Yeah, and another thing about Ned Yost, he wore number 3 as the Brewers manager to honor his late friend Dale Earnhardt.
Right.
And then they had a manager who is one of the few players to play for both Canadian teams, the Expos and the Blue Jays. You won't find many players doing that anymore since, of course, the Expos are no longer in Montreal. Right. And he also played in Japan, so very international playing career for this manager.
Are we talking about Ken Maka?
We are, yes.
Yeah, you threw me a little bit by skipping over Dale Swam, who finished out the 2008 season. But
yeah, he had 12 games as manager or something?
Yeah, the final 12 games and then the 2008 NLDS.
Yeah,
Maka was an older guy when he came into the Brewers organization. He had been a manager with the A's before, and he was a stark contrast from Ned Yost. He was a more quiet, cerebral type. Only with the Brewers for a couple of years. They had some pitching staffs under him that I think really kind of limited his ability to have success in Milwaukee. But yeah, a very memorable character for a very different reason from Ned Yost.
So yeah, you mentioned Dale Swam, who managed the last few games of that 2008 season, and then managed the playoffs for them. Well, this next manager was the first Brewer manager to lead the team to the playoffs while managing a full season, as previous managers who were managing the Brewers in the playoffs replaced fired managers during the year or did so in a strike-shortened season.
Yeah, that is Ron Roenicke. And I think the early days of the Roenicke era, the Brewers kind of were trending in one direction before, where when they hired Ron Roenicke, they were kind of trending towards a rebuild. They had Prince Fielder left for 1 year. It looked like they were going to trade him that winter and maybe head into a couple lean years and really give Ron Roenicke an opportunity to learn on the job in his first job as manager. And all of a sudden that winter, the tone changed. They picked up Zach Greinke that winter. They picked up Sean Markham that winter. And all of a sudden their new manager was right in the middle of a team that was expected to contend. So Ron Renicky really had to learn on the fly and to get the 2011 team to the postseason.
Yeah, now Ron Renicki's managing a different team with much different expectations as he's in Boston after, he got hired, I think, just before spring training. So yeah, completely different experience and expectations for him this year in Boston. He's been a long time bench coach, managed in the minors as well, I believe. And so that brings us to their current manager, who was on base for the last two World Series ending walk-off hits.
Oh man, it would be embarrassing if I missed this one after getting all the others. That one is Craig Counsell, who is on pace to become one of the winningest manager in Brewer franchise history within the next couple of years. I wrote a piece last winter about how, barring something massive and unforeseen, he would probably get there within the next 2.5 years. And then, of course, we got something massive with the first few months of the 2020 season being canceled. But Craig Counsell has very quickly gone from being a first-time manager to a real experienced veteran in that role. He's the longest tenured manager in the National League right now. He's a guy that I think strategically is very good day-to-day running a game, and has really kind of stabilized a young team. Has built an environment where this team can really be successful.
Yeah, no, you mentioned earlier that, David Stearns is often considered the smartest guy in the room. You could probably say the same thing. You could argue that when the managers get together, Craig Counsell might be the smartest guy in the room.
Yeah, I think Craig Counsell was he was in the middle of an evolution where a lot of young managers came into the game. But he's one of the few guys who was hired in kind of the first wave of that has actually lasted in the job. I mean, like I mentioned, he's the longest tenured National League manager. There's been a lot of stuff thrown against the wall in the National League over the last 5 years, and he was one of the few things that stuck. And so while a lot of folks from his generation have gotten an opportunity to try this and have found it maybe not to be not for them, Counsell has really settled into that role and stabilized it.
Okay, so yeah, you clearly know your managers as you were able to identify all of them. I know I went in order there pretty much, so if you know your history, but you clearly do as you're able to identify all of those. So I'm looking forward to what you've got on the players as we get to those guys shortly.
Yeah, I have been perusing this list for a couple days now, and so it's been good to get to think about some of these names again. Guys that I have written about a fair amount, either while they were active or going back to today in Brewer history. So it's going to be good to get an opportunity to revisit some of these.
Okay, sounds good. Let's look at the Brewers roster that I've assembled. And just to quickly remind you guys about the rules of the roster, going back 25 years, so going back to 1995, pick one player a year, cannot repeat players, and must form a coherent roster. And so we will start at the catching position, and I've got Jonathan Lucroy from 2014. He was worth 6.4 wins that year. Great production out of the catching position. Led the league in 53 doubles. You don't often see catchers lead the league in doubles, do you, Kyle?
Yeah, and Lucroy that season, it's worth noting that the B-WAR really doesn't include a lot of catcher defense. And so that number is probably even higher for Lucroy on some of the other sites. I did a piece this winter for Milwaukee Record where we looked at the top 50 players in the Brewers' first 50 seasons. And depending on which WAR format you use or which voter you listen to, we had Lucroy as high as like the sixth best Brewer of all time, just based on a relatively short tenure, but a really great presence behind the plate, a guy who could really swing the bat. Unfortunately, that success really has not followed him since he left Milwaukee, but a really memorable Brewer. And a guy who came up, wasn't really a top prospect, wasn't highly regarded on his way up the ladder, but just came up and was quietly productive for a long time.
Yeah, and so that year in 2014, hit 53 doubles. 13 home runs, not a lot, but hit 301, 373, 465, OPS plus of 131. So yeah, great production there out of the catching position with the starting catcher. As we move along to first base, we've got Prince Fielder from 09. He was worth 6.3 wins, 46 home runs that year, led the league with 141 RBI. 299, 412, 602 triple slash line, OPS of 1,014, OPS plus of 166. And yeah, Prince Fielder, I know after he left Milwaukee, he kind of fell off the map there. He had that neck injury, but in Milwaukee, he was very productive for his entire career and very durable as well.
Yeah, Fielder, it was interesting towards his later years in Milwaukee because the knock on Fielder was that his body wasn't going to age well, but his performance in Milwaukee really didn't show it at all. He was a guy who was in the lineup every single day. In fact, I think he was the last Brewer to play every game in a season. And just consistently productive, a guy who was very driven to perform, a guy who was almost entirely the opposite of his scouting report coming up as a young player. Who kind of had the knock of being looking a little bit unathletic, looking like a guy who maybe wasn't going to be dedicated to this. When he came up, and I think of all the Brewers that I have covered, he is probably the guy who is individually the most driven. And in the end, it was kind of hard to watch things come apart for him as he started to break down due to injuries a little bit. But for a guy who doesn't rank as the number one Brewer, kind of across the board in anything, I think he is one of the most memorable Brewers of all time, just from the way he played the game and the personality he brought to it, in addition to the fact that he was an extremely productive hitter.
Yeah, and he had a great walk-off home run celebration at one time, didn't he?
That's true. I think that actually was in the 2009 season, so you've captured that as well.
Moving along to second base, Ricky Weeks in 2010, worth 3.6 wins. He led the league in plate appearances and at bats, and also one of my favorite categories, led the league with 25 hit by pitches, 32 doubles, 29 home runs there. So some solid power out of the second baseman there.
Yeah, Weeks is one of the more polarizing Brewers ever because he came along at kind of a time in a transitional time in baseball statistics where I think a lot of the kind of older school folks were still evaluating players based on batting average. And Weeks was not great at that. He was a 230, 240 hitter for most of his career. But a guy who could really draw a walk, a guy who did, he got hit by pitches. He was constantly on base, was able to make things happen with his speed on the bases, generated a lot of value that way. And when you look at the last 25 years, he is quite clearly the best second baseman the Brewers have had over that span. And unless, if Keston Hiura keeps up his current pace and we do this again in 25 years, we'll probably be talking about him in a, maybe even a more glowing light. But Weeks had a really nice Brewer career, despite kind of being under the shadow of disappointment, I think, a little bit for a lot of fans.
Yeah, now moving along to third, Jeff Cirillo in 98, 5.9 wins above replacement, hit 321, 402, 445 that year. So, you like some more power out of your third baseman, but great batting average, great on base skills, over 400, although he did ground into 26 double plays, which led the league. Solid with the glove, though, worth 2 wins with the glove. And at shortstop, Bill Hall in 06, just a hair under 6 wins. He, triple slash line, 270, 345, 553, OPS of hair under 900. So, and he was worth 2.2 with the glove. So solid production off.
Hall played a little bit of everything that year. I think he played short primarily, but he also played around the infield. Before the Brewers moved him to center field. And I think this is individually, when you look at the stats from this single season, it certainly, it fits in with the others on this list. But I think as Brewer fans look at this list, this is one of the picks that's going to raise some eyebrows, because I think a lot of fans are going to be looking for J.J. Hardy here, who was hard to get in because some of his best years were just some of the Brewers' best years. And so, there were other guys from those seasons. But yeah, Hall, this is the year that got Hall a long contract extension that I think the Brewers ended up living to regret a little bit. But when you look back at these numbers, you can see why they were excited about him.
Yeah, I mean, 39 doubles, 35 home runs. So, I mean, out of the shortstop position, as you said, the versatility, he played a little third, he played some second, and even that year, he played some center field. So, yeah, a very versatile player and, man, impressive numbers.
Right.
Then in left field, there's really only one choice, and that would be Ryan Braun. We got him in 2011. That was his MVP year. He led the league in slugging and OPS. He hit 33 home runs, drove in over 100, stole 33 bags, hit 332. Now, Kyle, he won the MVP award that year.
He did.
What do people in Milwaukee think he deserved it?
I think Braun is a polarizing figure locally. I'm sure he's he's probably not a polarizing figure because I think there's probably one consensus opinion. I think some of the way that the following years were handled for Braun soured a lot of people on him, I understand. I think he got a bum rap on a little bit of that. I think certainly this is a case where certainly, how do I want to put this? There were certainly things here that shouldn't have happened. There are certainly things here that were regrettable and could have been handled differently. But Braun has been a very productive player for a long time. He's been a great asset to the Milwaukee community. He is somebody who routinely does, things like charity events and things like that to make Milwaukee a better place. And so I think as time has gone by, we still hear Braun booed a lot on the road, including by fan bases that are cheering their own former suspended steroid users. And so there's a little bit of hypocrisy there. But within Milwaukee, I think the portion of the fan base that still stands firmly on the, I'll never cheer for Ryan Braun standpoint is getting smaller and smaller as time goes by. And as it becomes clear that Braun is going to be probably the third best Brewer of all time when he retires. He's behind just a couple of Hall of Famers in Robin Yount and Paul Molitor. As a guy who was a very steady performer for a long time. Injuries have limited him a little bit in his later years, but just a really good Brewer and a guy who, because of his tendency to perform in the clutch, is really in the middle of some of the biggest moments in franchise history.
Now, Kyle, you cannot expect opposing fans to be logical in who they boo and who they don't boo.
Absolutely not.
Then in center field, we've got Carlos Gomez in 2013. He was also worth over 7.5 wins, 27 doubles, 24 home runs, swiped 40 bags.
It's interesting because as we look at this outfield, and I've got the WAR numbers here in front of me. I don't think a lot of Brewer fans would put Carlos Gomez right in between Christian Yelich and Ryan Braun. But his WAR numbers merit it, and it's at least in part because his defense was so spectacular that even in the years prior to this, when he had not been this kind of hitter, he was a very valuable player day in and day out for this team. Probably the best defensive center fielder this franchise has ever seen, and this franchise has the reigning Gold Glove Award winner in Lorenzo Cain. And so, it took a long time for Gomez to put this together. I think fans were frustrated with him for a long time and his offensive game kind of diminishing. But Gomez was also kind of a forerunner of the launch angle revolution. His game started to change around the time the Brewers stopped trying to get him to hit the ball on the ground and run fast. When he really started to swing away, we started to see his power numbers develop. And we started to see him really blossom into a player who had a peak that fits right in with a group of all-time greats.
Yeah, and he was that value with the glove was really shown in his metrics as well. Worth 3.6 wins with the glove that year. He was a Gold Glove winner. Not the most disciplined hitter. He struck out 146 times, only walked 37. But yeah, he brought a lot of value to the team. And then in right field, Christian Yelich, who they fleeced in that trade with Miami. They acquired him, and he's really blossomed in Milwaukee. In 2018, he was worth 7.3 wins. He was the MVP winner that year, led the league in batting at 326. He got on base over 400. He led the league in slugging, OPS plus, and total bases. MVP, All-Star, and Silver Slugger that year. And as I just mentioned, he's really blossomed there in Milwaukee to become one of the best players in baseball.
Yeah, I think when Yelich came over to Milwaukee, there was kind of a general feel that the move from Miami to Milwaukee would help him, that the ballpark would better suit his abilities. I don't think anybody realized just how much better he was going to get almost immediately, because he was a very good player in Miami, but he's been a spectacular player in Milwaukee. And a real cornerstone of a couple of postseason teams. And so, yeah, in a Brewer franchise that has made some really good trades, that, really kind of changed the fortune of the franchise in 1980 by acquiring Ted Simmons and Pete Vukovich and Raleigh Fingers in the same deal. I'm sure we're going to talk about the CC Sabathia deal at some point. This Yelich trade really stands out as maybe the best in franchise history. And it's despite the fact that the Brewers gave up some very talented and highly regarded prospects to get him.
Yeah, now moving along to the bench positions, I've got Jose Hernandez in 02 as the backup shortstop. He was solid with the glove, worth 1.9 wins with the glove. He was an all-star. Although he did strike out a lot, he led the league with 188 strikeouts. He still managed to hit 288. Aramis Ramirez. Oh, anything on Jose Hernandez?
Yeah, Hernandez was kind of an all-star because every team has to have an all-star. You talk about the 2002 Brewers, you're talking about a team that went 56 and 106. And Hernandez was a, very hyped free agent signing when the Brewers brought him in that really didn't turn out, I think, as well as many fans thought it would. But he had a quietly solid season in 2002 and was a bright spot on a team that was otherwise not very good.
Yeah, now last week, talking about the Cubs, guys who missed the cut, Aramis Ramirez, a lot of good years for the Cubs, but it just didn't work out to fit him into the puzzle of my Cubs roster. But here he is on the Brewers roster in 2012. Another guy who led the league in doubles with 50 doubles, also with 27 home runs, drove in over 100, hit 300. So solid year at third base for Aramis Ramirez. And then my final backup infielder, going all the way back to 1995, John Jaha, did not have a full season. I don't know if it was due to injuries or what, but while he was in there, he played very well, hit 313, 389, 579. So just 20 home runs in limited at-bats. It was a name that I had not heard in a while. And then in doing my research, came across him, and it brought back some memories just hearing that name.
Yeah, Jaha was a very interesting kind of all or nothing slugger before the era where that kind of came into vogue, and he later went to the A's and did it even more with them. The Brewers, that 1995 season, that was an abbreviated season because it started late due to the strike, but the Brewers had 10 Grand Slams that season, which is a franchise record, and I believe Jaha had multiple of them. A guy who just kind of always seemed to be at the plate in the big spot and came through a lot for that team and really kind of put himself on the map.
Then in the outfield, I've got Jeremy Burnitz from 97, worth almost 5 wins. He hit 281, 382, 553. So great production there. 37 doubles, 27 home runs, even stole 20 bags. He played. Go ahead.
Burnitz had a couple big years right after coming over in kind of an under-the-radar deal. He was acquired in a waiver trade when Kevin Seitzer went to Cleveland a couple years earlier. Burnitz was one of my first favorite Brewers, so I was excited to see him on this list. And when you look at this outfield, nitpicking at the roster, of course, we can do that to no end, but it's really hard to pick outfielders for this Brewers team because in addition to the 3 starters that you have, Braun, Gomez, and Yelich, who all deserve to be there, when you're talking about star Brewers from the last 25 years, you're talking about a lot of outfielders. Jeff Jenkins probably fits in as a top 10 Brewer of all time. Corey Hart is a guy that I think you could put in there, a guy who was a multi-time All-Star, a guy who was a Brewer for a long time. But Jeremy Burnitz was a real offensive star player for a Brewers team in kind of a dark era. So I was excited to get to revisit that name. I'm still on the lookout for a Jeremy Burnett's jersey from the era when the Brewers had the interlocking M&B logo that I'm the only person who likes. I was going to pick one up as a kid, and I went to the mall to get it, and they only had a youth size, and I never got one.
Oh, hate to see it. Now, in the backup catching position in 1999, I've got Dave Nilsson. Very productive with the bat. OPS plus of 141, hit 309, 400, 554. So, even better rate numbers than Lucroy. And he didn't have as many at bats there in 99. 19 doubles, 21 home runs. But wow, those are impressive numbers from offensively from a catcher.
Yeah, this was I think this was the last full season of Dave Nilsson's MLB career. He wanted to play for Australia in the 2000 Olympics, and the Brewers would not let him leave to do that. And so he went over to play in Japan and wrapped up his career over there. Nilsson was a very good offensive player who was probably miscast a little bit, especially towards the end of his career as a catcher. I think in the modern game, he would probably play first base or DH a lot more, and he did DH a lot for the Brewers during the years when they had that luxury. 99 was the start of the National League run, and so if he was going to be in the lineup, he had to be out in the field. But a very good offensive player, certainly for a long time, and a guy who, at this point in his career, really seemed like he was on track for much bigger things before going over to Japan, and I think kind of having some issues with conditioning kind of derailed his career a little bit.
All right, so now looking back over this, the position players, what do you think on these guys?
I think we talked about the two guys that I feel like are missing a little bit in Jeff Jenkins and J.J. Hardy, who are both guys that Milwaukee record this spring we put in the top 30 Brewers of all time. Jenkins is in the top 10. But this lineup has some really great nostalgia in it, some great guys to remember, and I think all told, it'd be hard to put together a more representative sample, given the limitations that you had.
Now moving along to the pitching staff, and we'll start with the starters. Ben McDonald in 1996, he went 12-10, ERA of 3.9, but an ERA plus of 133. Across 221 and a third innings, 2 complete games that year. He struck out 146. He was worth 5.4 wins.
Yeah, a bit of a deep cut here. Picking up Ben McDonald, who is a guy that I didn't immediately think of as one of the best Brewer pitchers in the last 25 years, but based on this season, clearly belongs there. I mean, the headline with McDonald is always going to be that he was a former number 1 overall pick in the draft, a guy whose career ended early. This was his second to last MLB season. Before injuries kind of derailed him, he was done in the big leagues before he was 30 years old. But a guy who was a very clear ace for this Brewer team during a really tough era to pitch. And really, it'd be interesting to see what he could do given modern sports medicine. If there would have been a push to not have him pitch so much when he was young, because he racked up his first 220 inning season already when he was 24 years old. But also to try to manage his workload and his rehab going forward, we could be talking about a guy who would have had a really long and successful big league career.
Now, another name who I did not necessarily expect to see on here, but who had a great season, Jeff D'Amico in 2000. He went 12-7. He only started 23 games that year, but an ERA of 2.66 in 162 and a third innings. He struck out only 101, but an ERA plus of 171. So, yeah, impressive year in those limited starts there from D'Amico.
Yeah, I know somebody whose screen name for a long time was Jeff D'Amico's One Big Year. This was the year that really convinced a lot of folks that the Brewers really had something special in D'Amico. He is another guy who physically just kind of didn't handle the strain of being developed in the era before I think teams really came into understanding how to develop and protect young pitching. But for this brief flash of time, D'Amico really looked like he was going to be a kind of a centerpiece of the Brewers' future.
A moment ago, you mentioned the 2000 Sydney Olympics that Dave Nilsson won to play in those. Now we come to another player who did play in those for
Right.
America, and that's Ben Sheets, who was the gold medalist pitcher. He won the gold medal on that American team there. In 2004, I got him on my Brewers roster. He actually his win-loss record was below 500, 12 and 14. Of course, nowadays we know not to measure a pitcher by his wins and his losses. He was worth 7.3 wins that year, ERA of 2.7, 5 complete games, 237 innings, 264 strikeouts, led the league in strikeouts to walk at 8.25. He had a whip under 1. His ERA plus was 162. A huge year from Ben Sheets that year in 2004.
Yeah, this is the year that Ben Sheets should have won the National League Cy Young. And the only reason that he didn't, well, the two reasons that he didn't was because this was before we realized that wins and losses were a really poor way to measure pitcher performance. And the Brewers really didn't support him much offensively. This was not a very good Brewer team in 2004. The 2001 to 2004 teams, generally speaking, were pretty terrible across the board. But Sheets was a real bright spot on it. This is the year when he set the Brewers single game strikeout record. He had a really weak cast of characters around him in 2004, but on the days when he was on the mound, he was still appointment viewing. He was a guy who was going to single-handedly keep the team in the game on those days. And so, yeah, I think if I were going to pick an opening day starter from this group that we've got here, it's Sheets, and then I'd maybe see if Sheets could pitch again the second day because he's just head and shoulders above the group here.
Yeah, and he finished 8th in the voting. He was named on one ballot, I think, that year.
Right.
And that win-loss record certainly had something to do with the voting. I think, if you revoted now with the way that we analyze players, that voting would come out very differently. Moving along to 2008. CC Sabathia, an abbreviated time there in Milwaukee. He was acquired in a trade. He started 17 games for the Brewers, but wow, were those something. He was in that short time and essentially half a season. He accumulated 5.2 WAR for the Brewers. He went 11-2, ERA of 1.65, 7 complete games, 3 shutouts. He struck out just about a batter an inning, and his ERA plus 255. Wow. He basically carried the Brewers into the postseason that year. I think down the stretch, didn't he throw like multiple games on short rest?
Yeah, the Brewers brought Sabathia in as a guy who was about to become a free agent, had been a dominant pitcher, was the defending AL Cy Young winner, but it had kind of a rough start to the 2008 season. And they brought him in, and despite the fact that it was probably not in his best interest to do so, he really put that team on his back down the stretch. He pitched, as you mentioned, a lot on short rest. The entire month of September, he pitched on short rest that year. He pitched deep into games. He threw a lot of pitches. He really took a pretty significant risk for a guy who was in line for a huge payday the day after that season was over. And he is the reason the Brewers went to the playoffs in 2008. Without him, they almost certainly do not make it. It came down to the season's final day, even with him. And so I think for a guy who pitched in Milwaukee just slightly more than half a season, he was acquired just before the All-Star break that July. This is probably still for a lot of fans of kind of my generation, a top 5 all-time Brewer, a guy who they still think fondly on. There were a lot of Brewer fans watching his final start last season, getting upset about, losing out on CC Sabathia in the game. And that's not the kind of thing you usually hear for a guy who was in a city less than a full year. But the impression that CC Sabathia made here was that great that I think a lot of Brewer fans still see him as their guy, even though he was, only in Milwaukee for a brief amount of time.
Yeah, and it was fun to see him swing it as well. He hit some big long home runs.
Yeah, Sabathia did everything he could to help that team that year, including at the plate. And so it was just a tremendously fun opportunity to get to see him.
Now the final starter, we got Giovanni Gallardo from 2007. He only made 17 starts that year as well. He went 9-5. 110 and a third innings, ERA plus of 121, ERA of 367. Gallardo seems like a guy who was kind of about to break through, but never really kind of became that ace that maybe the Brewers were expecting.
Yeah, Gallardo kind of had the curse of high expectations for a long time over his run in Milwaukee, because in these early years, and especially as you mentioned this 2007 season that's on the roster here, he really looked like a guy who was just about to be, kind of one of the dominant pitchers in baseball if he could just get over the hump. And he never really did. He was always a guy who was kind of a 5 or 6 inning guy. He was a guy who really liked to nibble, and so his pitch counts got high. He was a guy who never really developed the full arsenal that he needed to put guys away consistently without having to throw a lot of pitches. But what that overshadows is the fact that he was quietly a very good pitcher for a long time. And I think it's just unfortunate that what fans remember is that he didn't really reach the level of greatness they expected. And that kind of prevented them from fully appreciating a guy who is one of the top pitchers in Brewer franchise history.
Now moving along to the bullpen, Chad Fox in 01, he went 5-2, sub 2 ERA at 189 across 66 and 2/3 innings. He struck out 80 guys, so just under 11 strikeouts per 9 innings. Danny,
We've got 3 guys in the group here that we might as well discuss together, so I'll let you the next 2 also.
Danny Kolb in 03, he also had a sub 2 ERA, 196, struck out just about a batter an inning. And Derek Turnbow in 05, 7-1, and guess what? He also had a sub 2 ERA at 1.74 across 67 and a third innings, and he struck out also just under a batter an inning.
Yeah, the Brewers had a nice run here in the 2000s where it seemed like they were able to find guys who were about to break out as closers. And in a couple of cases, they sold relatively high on those guys eventually, and built some pieces that helped them down the road. Derek Turnbow has, I think, one of the more unfortunate claims to fame in Brewer history. The Brewers made a bobblehead of him that had real hair. And he, on the day the bobblehead was given out, he blew the save, which led to some unfortunate outcomes for a lot of those bobbleheads. Made them even more of a collector item than they would have been before. But it really, on that day, it almost seemed like his career turned downward. And it was a reminder of just how mercurial big league relievers can be, that you get guys who are kind of dominant for a year or maybe 18 months and it comes apart. But yeah, there's some real blasts from the past here. Guys who had really great runs that kind of peaked in Milwaukee.
So among these 7 relievers, we've got those 3 from that brief stretch. So the next 4 are also from a kind of stretch in a row. We've got Francisco Rodriguez, K-Rod in 2015. Towards the end of his long career, he went, had an ERA 2.21. He saved 38 games for them. Let's see. He's still at that age, 62 strikeouts in 57 innings. Then Tyler Thornburg in 2016, he was worth 2.5 wins, ERA of 2.15, ERA plus of 199. And he, 90 strikeouts in 67 innings, but if you're not impressed by that, wait for these next 2 guys, because Tyler Thornburg in 2016, 8-5 out of the pen. That's a lot of decisions out of the pen. ERA of 2.15, closed 13 games. He struck out 90 guys in 67 innings.
And Thornburg really ended up being a big part of the next winning Brewer team, although not directly, because that big season led to the Red Sox putting together a really nice package to trade for him, including Travis Shaw, who went on to be a really big part of the 2018 team.
And then Corey Knebel in 2017, he was worth 3.7 wins out of the pen. Wow. Led the league in appearances at 76. He went 1-4, but he had a 1.78 ERA, closed 39 games. He struck out, get ready for this, 126 guys in 76 innings. a hair under 15 strikeouts per nine. And that brings us to Josh Hader, the lefty from 2019. ERA of 2.62. He went 3-5. 75 and 2/3 innings in 61 appearances, which you don't see that out of the pen, like you used to. And he struck out 138, good for 16.4 strikeouts per inning. So, wow. In the kind of those last 5 years, getting these 4 relievers, that's a lot of strikeouts.
Yeah, I think the bullpen, if you were to put this roster up against other teams, this Brewer bullpen would be a real strength to work with, because there are so many guys here who were lights out closers. Hader added such tremendous flexibility by being able to get more than the final 3 outs. The Brewers have really used that to their advantage a fair amount. The opportunity to bring him in to get some outs in the 8th, or to get a key lefty, because he is so hard on guys from the left side. And so, yeah, when you look at how spoiled the Brewers have been the last few years out of their bullpen, and this isn't even all of them, there have been some really great bullpen performances, guys like Jeremy Jeffress that don't show up on this list, John Axford, who doesn't show up on this list, but was also a really great, maybe the single season best Brewer closer of all time, despite being on a franchise that included Raleigh Fingers. And so, yeah, this bullpen put together would be a pretty formidable group. If the Brewers took a lead into even about the 5th or 6th inning with this roster available, it would be kind of lights out.
Yeah, there's no debating that. Obviously, saves are not the best way to measure a reliever, but these guys, all of these guys have closing experience. I mean, Chad Fox only had 2 saves in this year, but everyone else, Tyler Thornburg had 13. The other guys were all in the upper 30s. Danny Kolb 21, but Turnbow, K-Rod, Knebel, and Hader all in the upper 30s. So, yeah, a lot of saves out of this team. Very strong bullpen. How do you feel about the starting rotation here?
I think this rotation on paper would be Sheets and Sabathia certainly would stand out. We talked a little bit about the full picture of Ben McDonald. But when you look at the smaller picture of this season, you're looking at a guy who was really dominant and kind of belongs in this conversation. There were better Gallardo seasons than this one, I think, probably. I recognize that the limitations of 1 player per year probably precluded some of the better years. This is a good group. And I think as they stack up against other teams, you'll probably get a little more star power on some of those other rosters in the 4th and 5th spot in the rotation. But all told, if you had Craig Counsell as the manager of this group, and so he knew that he could use these guys for 4 innings, then head to his bullpen, I think you could see these guys manage really effectively.
That's true. That's a good point. So, yeah, that's the roster that I've assembled. And again, any listeners out there, if you want to make your own roster, whether it's a Brewers roster or a roster for another team, you can head to my website, boxseatbanter.com. I have a link to download a template off Google Spreadsheets. So you can download that, make your own roster. And if you do, submit it, I would love to see that. And so, yeah, Kyle, thanks for your perspective on these players. You've clearly got a very strong knowledge of the Brewers. So it is great to hear your perspective on all of these players.
Yeah, well, it's great to get to discuss some of these guys again. A lot of these are guys that I either grew up watching or covered myself, and so it's cool to get an opportunity to go back and talk about them.
Kyle, you've already mentioned some names that I did not have on my list, but why don't we touch on those again as we go over the toughest decisions here on my roster?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of Brewers that aren't just great Brewers from the last 25 years. They're all-time great Brewers that fell off this roster for a couple reasons. We talked about there being a really crowded outfield on this roster. You could build a all-time Brewer roster for the last 25 years that has 7 or 8 outfielders on it, and talk about guys like Greg Vaughn, Corey Hart. But I think the name that really sticks out for me, and when I was looking at the roster, one of the roster moves that I would consider making from 2005, I think I would bump Derek Turnbow out of the bullpen. Turnbow was a really fun story and a really dominant reliever for a brief period of time, but bumping him off the roster would give me an opportunity to put Jeff Jenkins in. And Jenkins is, we did the story at Milwaukee Record this spring. He's one of the top 10 Brewers of all time. A guy who was a real bright spot on some rough Brewer teams in the early 2000s. A guy who was a Brewer for a long time. I think this roster is missing something without him. So I think he's probably number one for me on the list of guys that I would like to see.
Yeah, that was a great example. I mean, that year, you had 25 home runs, 42 doubles, hit almost 300, 400, 500 as he 292, 375, 513 triple slash. Yeah, he's one of the guys I had on my list. And I'm not a Brewer fan, but I definitely, when I think of the Brewers and some of their great players, especially in more recent years, he's one of the guys I think of. So, yeah, it was surprising that I wasn't able to find a slot for him. And taking a reliever over him in 05, relievers aren't the most valuable players, but yeah, that was just how I lined it up. And
sure,
maybe some of the listeners out there, some of your readers, you go ahead and make your own Brewers roster. Again, quick reminder, visit the website boxseatbanter.com. You can download a template, a Google spreadsheet template to make your own roster. So I would love to see those, and I'm sure a bunch of people would have Jeff Jenkins on their roster. Corey Hart, I wasn't sure if he would be able to catch the fly balls at night when he's wearing his sunglasses.
There we go.
Was that a common kind of joke in Milwaukee with him?
I think that showed up just about once in every game that Corey Hart played, and there were almost 1,000 games he played as a Brewer. So yeah, we've heard that joke. We've also heard the "Never Surrender" line, supercut Corey Hart song. But we definitely went through Corey Hart's musical catalog during his time in Milwaukee. There was a span of time during Corey Hart's tenure with the Brewers that there were actually 2 Corey Harts in the Brewers organization at the same time. So yeah, we really got some mileage out of those jokes.
Yeah, the other kind of player that I was struggling with, and another guy was BJ Surhoff, and this is going back to 1995. I was kind of deciding between him and John Jaha. They both were worth about the same. Surhoff had more games, so Jaha had better stats in a shorter time period. But he's somebody who I kind of associate with the Brewers. But then when you go back and look at his BBref page, he's definitely a Brewer, but that was kind of pre this time period. 95 when this roster started was his last year in Milwaukee.
Right.
But he's another guy. You go ahead.
I also looked at 95 because if you took my proposed roster move and dumped Derek Turnbow for Jeff Jenkins, you'd probably want a pitcher back.
Mm-hmm.
So I also looked at some options from that 95 team. And a name that came up for me is Ricky Bonas, who pitched on that 95 team, who threw 200 innings that year in a strike-shortened season. Really took the ball a lot for that Brewer team in a difficult run-scoring environment, and he got knocked around a little bit, but he would be a really great innings eater to have in the rotation. Or Mike Fetters, the closer from that team, go straight reliever for reliever, had 22 saves in an abbreviated year that year, only pitched in 40 games, but was pretty effective there as well. And so, yeah, the 95 team, for a shortened season and a season the Brewers weren't very good, there's kind of a variety of interesting candidates there.
Okay, yeah, definitely a good idea there if we want to switch things up. The other guys that I had, you talked about the strength of the outfield. Lorenzo Cain, he's only been there a short time, but he's another guy who missed the cut. It's funny doing the Cubs episode last week. They had, other than Sammy Sosa, their outfield is very weak. Then we come here to Milwaukee, and their outfield is very talented. The pitchers, I didn't really, it was coming up with all the starters. It was tough to find all those guys. I'm not sure if I missed a starter. Kyle, you can let me know on that. And then the reliever, you mentioned him. Another reliever that I did miss was John Axford. But yeah, were there any starters or any other relievers that I missed?
I mean, there's nobody that's going to jump off the page and say, "Oh, you can't make a Brewer team without this guy." But I think Doug Davis was a guy who had some really nice years in kind of the mid 2000s on some Brewer teams that otherwise were a little dark. Chris Capuano had a couple of good years with the Brewers, kind of around the same time, kind of in that build up to their run of relevance from 2008 to 11. And so a couple of guys that I maybe would have considered, but all told, there wasn't a guy on this roster that I was burning to swap out on the pitching side.
Yeah,
The last name we need to mention is a guy who was maybe an all-time great Brewer, and I looked around this morning and tried to find a way to get him on the roster and couldn't find it, is J.J. Hardy.
Yeah.
Probably almost certainly is the Brewers' best shortstop of the last 25 years. I think as you build the roster, you looked a lot at single season numbers. And then I looked at it and thought, oh, okay, you can't leave off this guy who was a Brewer for 8 years, or, kind of the body of work kind of guys. The only way I could find to get J.J. Hardy on the roster was to move Giovanni Gallardo off and kind of create a different problem. So I think all told, J.J. Hardy probably on my version of the roster remains the top snub.
Okay, yeah, it is it's quite the puzzle to fill as you got to get everyone in here, and that creates a lot of problems. Unable to get all the players that we want on here. But yeah, that's those were some very tough decisions. I'm sure the listeners will agree. And again, I would love to see any Brewer roster submissions. Maybe they can figure out a way to get JJ Hardy, Jeff Jenkins on the roster to replace some of these guys. And I'm sure there's plenty of people that are thinking, Billy, how are you leaving off a 400 hitter for the Brewers? And that's a great question. Wondering how I left Tyrone Taylor off my roster from last year, from 2019. Tyrone, graduate of Torrance High. He hit 400 in limited time for the Brewers last year. Hopefully he will be on this roster in the future as well. We'll now get to the questions posed to our listeners on Twitter and Instagram. So again, make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Box Seat Banter. We pose those questions before recording each week. Our first question comes from Sam Travlos, who was on the show last week with us discussing the Cubs. So this question might be a bit based on his perception of the Cubs. He says, with Kane opting out and Yelich's slow start, how do you feel about the Brewers' playoff chances this year?
Well, the Brewers' playoff chances would probably be a little bit bleak if not for the massively expanded playoff picture. And the questions about whether or not the Cardinals are even going to play an MLB season this year. The Brewers right now, despite kind of a rough run and despite an ugly loss to the Cubs on Thursday night, still are in position to be the second team from the NL Central to make the postseason. And it's going to be, for the teams that get to the postseason as kind of the 6 through 8 seeds this year, anything still could happen. All they need to do is win 2 out of 3 to unseat a really good team, or the Marlins, as the case may be, and move on to the playoff rounds. So I still think this Brewer team has the pieces necessary to get hot for a few weeks if they reach the postseason. I am not super optimistic about what this team would look like over a 162-game season. This team, as constructed right now, just isn't very productive. They had a stretch last week where they had 6 middle infielders on the roster at the same time. They play a lot of positions, but they don't do it well. And so, this Brewer team right now, over the course of a long year, maybe wouldn't be very good, but in a 60-game season where all they need to do is be the second best team in an NL Central where teams are literally falling off the map, I think their chances of reaching the postseason are pretty good.
Yeah, and so reminder, the rules for the playoffs this year, the division winners get in and the second seeds get in, and the next 2 overall in the league. So there will probably be 2 divisions that have 3 teams out of the 5 make it to the playoffs. So yeah,
There could even be a division with 4, although the NL Central probably will not be that because the Pirates have already fallen way off the pace.
Yeah, it could be 4. I think with, only playing your division, and I think it would be tough because you'd beat up on each other. So, but yeah.
The odd thing that's going to come of this, and I wrote about this a couple weeks ago, fans really need to root against their own league in interleague play.
Yeah.
Because that's where the difference could happen. If the NL East gets destroyed by the AL East this year, which is a thing that could happen, that's going to really impact an NL Central team, for example's chances of reaching the postseason, because all those AL teams or all the NL teams will fall back, and the AL teams aren't the teams you're competing with.
Exactly.
So not having those head-to-head matchups is going to lead to a lot of scoreboard watching.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is the 60-game sprint. It's something different, but yeah. So despite those obstacles that the Brewers are facing this year, they still got a very good shot of making the postseason. Our next question comes from Joey, who was on the program a few weeks ago discussing the Pirates. The Brewers' playoff runs in recent years have me hooked and waiting for more. Why couldn't we get these guys in the AL instead of the Trastros? It is funny, that we had to have 2 different teams switch leagues over,
right?
Not too long time frame. And Joey continues, okay, but seriously, what's your favorite move the front office has made for a recent playoff push?
Well, I think we talked at some length before about the Yelich trade, which is going to go down, I think, as maybe one of the better trades in franchise history, despite the fact that the Brewers have made some really good ones. The Sabathia move certainly stands out. We didn't talk about the Zach Greinke trade before, but that's one that stands out. But the Yelich move really changed the course of this franchise. Bringing in a guy who's maybe could have been back-to-back NL MVP if he hadn't gotten hurt last September. It changed everything around this team and really created a tone for back-to-back postseason appearances for the second time in franchise history. And so I think that the Yelich trade has to be number one. And jumping back to the league change, I really, being around Brewers fans a lot and catching a lot of Brewer baseball, I really never heard anybody complain about moving from the American League to the National League. And it was a bit of an upgrade in division, having to take on the Cubs and Cardinals every year, who were kind of perpetually either good or on the cusp of being good. But I think the NL style of baseball really was something that Brewer fans picked up pretty quickly and really enjoyed. And so I don't know that there's a lot of Brewer fans that are excited about, kind of the AL style of baseball becoming both league style of baseball this year. And when it was time for a team to move back to the American League, I don't recall any Brewers fans making the case that it should be the Brewers. I remember a lot of other fan bases making the case that it should be the Brewers, trying to make that decision for the Brewers. But here in Wisconsin, I think fans are pretty happy with the way that worked out.
Yeah, I mean, I do miss that NL style of play right now. I'm hoping that it's only temporary, that we get that, the DH goes back to the American League only, but I'm not very confident in that.
Right.
Our next question comes from Brett Carpenter. Has a game for the Brewers ever been snowed out? And I think, he's a big Packers fan. I know he's been to Lambeau Field in the freezing winter. But has there ever been a Brewers game that's been snowed out that you're aware of? I know now that, in Miller Park with the roof, they should not have any weather issues for games, but back at County Stadium, have they?
Yes, and I'm working to find the games where it happened. I know the Brewers' home opener was snowed out in 1973. There have been an awful lot, and actually the Milwaukee Braves used to have this problem more often. There were years where the Braves went to the month of May, and it seemed like they had played 3 or 4 games heading into the month of May, just because they'd get the home opener in, and then 3 or 4 games would be missed, and you have to deal with travel issues. So yes, there have been snowouts. The Miller Park roof it gets brought up a lot, but it really has been a game changer for baseball in the state of Wisconsin, because it really does mean that for fans across the state, if you make plans to go to Milwaukee for a game, even if it's 40 degrees outside, even if it's pouring down rain, even if there's snow in the forecast, you're going to go inside and be comfortable and watch a game. And for an organization like the Brewers that really depends upon support from a wide geographic market to sell tickets and be successful, there were a lot of April and May games at County Stadium where, it was a real risk if you bought a ticket and drove in from somewhere else to see the game. That no longer exists at Miller Park. There have been 2 rain delays in Miller Park history, both in games where a quick rainstorm popped up too soon to close the roof. But aside from that, when you go to a game at Miller Park, you're going to see baseball. There have been some times over the 20 years of Miller Park where the baseball hasn't been very good. But there's been a lot of baseball there.
All right. So, yes, we have had snowouts back in the old Milwaukee County Stadium days. And the points that you bring up, it is interesting. This will be a point on another podcast, I'm sure. Why Target Field in Minnesota does not have a roof.
Yeah, I think, I know they were trying to cram it into a very tight footprint. And so, the Miller Park roof, when you look at that ballpark, there's kind of a lot of non-baseball space in the ballpark. The park was constructed in the middle of a parking lot, so the footprint wasn't an issue. But yeah, Target Field is a beautiful ballpark on the correct day. Because of the nature of the summer weather in Minnesota and the spring weather in Minnesota, that perfect day happens about 10 or 12 times a year.
Okay, the last thing I want to bring up is a Brewers podcast, and I'm not as involved in the Brewers as you are, so maybe you'll have some perspective on this. What are the Brewers fans' thoughts on Front Row Amy?
I think Front Row Amy is a woman who has had a single seat in the front row at the Brewers games now for several years. She draws a lot of attention for her clothing choices and her body type. I have not met her personally. I know a few people who have had, and they've all come away with positive things to say. It is certainly, it has created some odd conversations around the ballpark, I think, over the years. I'm trying to come off as neutral on this because I don't want to hate on how anybody else does fandom. That's really a personal decision. But yeah, it has certainly created some conversations I never expected to have about ballpark behavior.
Do the Brewers have cardboard cutouts in
They do.
Does she have one, do you know?
They just recently added cardboard cutouts directly behind home plate. Previously, they had been other parts of the ballpark. This week was the first time they've been behind home plate. And I think the seat that she normally occupies has an ad over it right now. So I think she has one, but I could be mistaken on that. I haven't taken a full inventory of the cardboard cutouts at this point.
Okay, now those are the questions that we got this week. Again, make sure to follow on Twitter and Instagram so that you can get those questions in. We pose those every week, and we love getting to them on the program. I know we've been discussing the strengths and weaknesses of the roster throughout the program, but Kyle, now it's time to grade the roster. So I'll throw it to you first. What do you think about this roster, the strengths and the weaknesses, and what grade would you issue to the roster I've created?
I think as you look across this group as a whole and you look at these single season performances, and we talked about this a little bit before, I think in building this roster, you maybe weighed a single season performance and kind of the raw numbers of single seasons above the body of work for Brewers players. But if you could put this group together, this lineup would be quite something. I mean, this is all-star to MVP caliber players pretty much across the starting lineup. The bench would be very good. And then when you look at this bullpen, it would also be pretty lights out after about the fourth or fifth inning if the starters could get them that far. This group of starting pitchers, there are some question marks here. I think Sheets and Sabathia would be really great. The combination of early career Giovanni Gallardo, 1996 Ben McDonald, and 2000 Jeff D'Amico probably won't scare other teams as much as some of the other last 25-year teams will. This is a Brewer team that just hasn't had a lot of dominant starting pitching performances over that time. So I think all told, this roster, as compared to what you'll probably see from other teams, is maybe a solid, B minus. Just because I think the starting staff on other teams will be so good that it will sometimes overshadow this group. But all told, if you could put this group together and run them out against the other 25-year rosters, I think this team would still win a lot of games based on their lineup and their ability to preserve lead slate.
Yeah, they definitely – the outfield is just loaded. I mean, all those guys – Braun, Gomez, Yelich are all dynamic offensive players with all the tools on offense. Gomez, great defender. Braun, not the best defender, but yeah, just very talented players. So I love that outfield. The defense is solid. Overall, I would say, even though there are, MVP caliber players, I think that the offense is over average overall, comparing it to all the other teams. As you mentioned, the pitchers are not great, but they're kind of, they're sneaky good. Obviously, Sabathia in that half season, right. You're not going to find a performance better than that. That is Cy Young caliber, absolutely guaranteed slam dunk if he does that over the full season. And so, yeah, he was just dominant. Ben Sheets, he's not remembered as being as great as he was. He didn't have that long career, I think, that, some of the other guys do who we associate with greatness. But yeah, as you mentioned, those other guys aren't necessarily going to scare you, but I think they're sneaky good. The bullpen is a strength. I think it's one of the stronger bullpens overall. Good strikeout rate. The bullpen had a strikeout rate of 12 per 9. The team, the rotation as a whole, 9.2 per 9. So good strikeout rate. But yeah, I think that with the strength of some other teams' rotations and some of the strengths of some other teams, maybe infields, and I give them a C+ overall. With the strength of the bullpen, the starters don't have to be as good as some of the other teams. It would be interesting to see it play out. So, we won't be able to get it in actuality, but I do have a potential way of testing this out. I haven't announced it yet, but that's a little teaser for our listeners. So be on the lookout for that. But yeah, so pretty close in our gradings. You said a B minus. I went with C+. So listeners out there, share your thoughts on how you would grade this roster. Kyle, it's time to come to a close. So as we always do, we'll share our final thoughts. So what are your final thoughts on the Brewers?
As we look at these 25 years, it's been a fun opportunity to go back and really remember 3 different eras of Brewer baseball. Kind of the late 90s, the end of the Phil Garner era, the transition from the American League to the National League, some really dark times and kind of the rebuild from it in the early 2000s, and then building up to that 2008 playoff team, and then the modern era, and this Brewer team that coming into this year was on kind of the best run in franchise history with back-to-back playoff appearances, the 2018 NL Central Championship. I would be curious if we talk about this in another decade again, how we'll talk about the next 10 years. Because this is a Brewer team now that has kind of transitioned away from a lot of the guys that made them really successful in 2019. It's a Brewer team that has an opportunity to reload or might fall back into rebuilding a little bit. And so, it's been fun to look at these eras across time, but I think it's also a reminder of in baseball just how fast things can change. And for a mid to small market team like the Brewers, what it looks like when they do. And so, thank you for the opportunity to go back and revisit and kind of remember these guys, and to really look at a collection of very disparate Brewers baseball.
Yeah, you bring up some interesting points. From an outsider, they were kind of a non-factor for most of the years. They've had a couple runs there, that CC Sabathia-led run in 2008 that you mentioned. And then now recently, they've definitely been been a factor though with those trades that they've made. They've got Yelich, and I think that Melvin and now Stearns have done a good job to turn them into a contender. They seem like a very well-run team. The window may be closing now, though. I know Braun is at the, he's nearing the end of his career. I don't know how much longer he's got left. Yelich is still in his prime. But yeah, they are in that kind of transition phase. You just mentioned, things can turn very quickly. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the Brewers do. Some teams, they try to hang on to contend, and then they fall off the map for a few years. But I feel like, and I may be wrong here, but I feel like they are run very well at the top. So they will be able to find a way to transition to continue to contend. They've got that second base prospect, Keston. How do you say his last name? Keston Hiura. He, who could potentially be, an all-star for several years. You pair him with Yelich. I'm not sure where all the pitching will come from.
And that's kind of the question that they have to answer is that, when you look at the 2019 team and the 2018 team, 4 of the top 7 players, at least in terms of Baseball Reference WAR, from that 2019 team aren't on the 2020 team. Between Eric Thames and Yasmani Grandal and Mike Moustakas, guys who left, and then additionally Lorenzo Cain opting out for the 2020 season. It's a really stark reminder of how fast things can change for a small market team. And the new wave of guys that the Brewers brought in to replace those guys, they went a little less expensive. They kind of shopped on the clearance rack a little bit. Some of those guys haven't been real effective yet. But we're going to know a lot more about the future of the Brewers organization, I think, in a couple of months, because we're going to get an opportunity to see in kind of a short season what they do. And I think as hard as it is to evaluate guys on that small of a sample size, we're going to know a lot more about where this organization is going for the next 5 years once we see how this experiment kind of plays out in a short run.
Yeah, so we'll see how, if they're able to extend their window or maybe create a new window here very shortly. But they are a factor now, and, I'll be interested to keep on watching them. They're a team, just the way that they're run, and Yelich is an easy guy to root for, and those uniforms are great. So I love seeing them out there. So continue to watch and root for the Brewers. And Kyle, I really enjoyed having you on the program. So again, the Twitter was @by Kyle Loebner. And yeah, so it was a pleasure to have you on. Very knowledgeable about the Brewers. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, and for folks who enjoy talking about Brewer history or reading about Brewer history and looking at guys like the guys we've talked about on the podcast here, check out my Patreon. It's patreon.com/Kyle Loebner. That's LOB as in boy, NER. I write Today in Brewer History every day, 365 days a year. I've been doing it since the season was postponed in March. I'm going to try to keep it going all the way through to next March. It's free for everyone to read. If you sign up there, you can get it delivered directly to your inbox. And it's an opportunity to kind of look back on cool stuff from across Wisconsin baseball history for the last 70 years.
Okay, so make sure to check that out. And again, thank you, Kyle, for joining us. You can make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram. It's @BoxSeatBanter on both of those platforms. This is Billy Ballas of Box Seat Banter signing off.